40 miles from a county courthouse on the gravel shoulder of Route 70. A 10-year-old boy propped a flattened cardboard box against his knees and lettered it slow, the marker almost dry. Please, trial at 9, need a ride. His name was Caleb Mercer, and in a few hours, a courtroom 40 miles down that highway would decide whether the man raising him went home that night or did not. He had asked every adult he knew for a ride. Every one of them had found a reason not to give him one. So at 5 a.m, with the sky still the color of a bruise, Caleb Mercer walked out onto the shoulder of a highway by himself and held up a sign. And by the time the sun cleared the tree line, 60 motorcycles would be standing in silence on the courthouse steps for his sake alone. Before we get into how that happened, tell us, what time are you listening tonight? And where are you listening from? Caleb had lived with Roy Tanner for 14 months by then, and the trial date had been pinned to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a sunflower for 6 weeks, ever since a subpoena arrived in a plain envelope addressed to a minor witness. Roy was 44, built like a man who worked with his hands, and he kept a handshake in reserve for caseworkers and teachers and anyone else with the power to write a report about him. Warm, steady, held a beat too long. That handshake never made it through the front door. What replaced it at home was quieter than shouting, and it did its work slower and just as completely. Most nights, some version of the same sentence, that nobody believes a foster kid over a grown man, that a court date would come and go and change nothing at all, that Caleb was welcome to try. He said it while jingling his truck keys, the same 3 keys turned over and over in one fist, a habit so constant that Caleb had learned the sound of it the instant he heard it, the way a house learns the particular creak of one loose stair. 3 weeks earlier, a caseworker named Priya Nair had come by for a scheduled visit, clipboard in hand, and Caleb had watched from the top of the stairs as Roy became a different man in the space of one doorbell. He offered coffee. He asked about her drive. He talked about Caleb's grades with a warmth that filled the whole downstairs, said the word proud twice, and walked her back out to her car with a handlight on her shoulder, laughing at something she'd said. She wrote in her notes that the home presented as stable and the child as well cared for. She left 40 minutes later, satisfied, unaware that the moment her taillights cleared the driveway, Roy had gone back to whatever he had been before she rang the bell. Caleb learned that day, in a way no one had to explain to him twice, exactly how much a clipboard could see and exactly how much it could not. On the morning of the trial, Roy left before 6 without a word about a ride. His truck backing out of the driveway while Caleb stood at the window in his church clothes with nobody left in the house to ask. There should have been a caseworker assigned to drive him, a scheduling gap nobody had caught in time or nobody had bothered to catch. There was no neighbor he trusted enough to knock for. So Caleb went out to the garage and found a flattened moving box behind the recycling bin. And by the gray light through the little window, he lettered it with a marker he had to shake twice to get working, then folded it once down the middle to make it easier to carry. He walked the 1.5 miles to the on-ramp with the sign held flat against his chest and the subpoena folded small in his coat pocket, its contents already memorized. He had gone over what he saw the night of the crash so many times in his head that the details had worn smooth, like a coin carried in a pocket long enough to lose its edges. The mile marker, the plate, the order it all happened in. He only needed one adult willing to let him say it out loud. He had been standing on the shoulder for 40 minutes, sign up, thumb out on the rare car that slowed and then didn't. Watching the traffic thin and thicken with the shift change 3 exits down, when the sound behind him changed, not one engine, but a low column of them, coming out of the gray at a speed that made the gravel under his sneakers hum. He did not run. He knew the patch that column carried well enough from the news to guess what was rolling toward him, and holding his ground on an open shoulder while it closed in cost him more than he had left to spend being afraid of it too. One rider peeled off and rolled to a stop a few yards short of him. Boots down, engine idling low. She was young for the vest she wore. Dark hair pulled back, sharp-eyed under a half visor. The first thing she did was nothing at all. She sat there a moment and read his sign, top to bottom, before she said a single word to him. "You're standing on mile marker 112?" she said finally, in a voice that carried more weight than the sentence should have held. Caleb told her his name and where he needed to be, and by what time, plain and rehearsed. The sentence worn smooth from 100 repetitions in his head on the walk here. She was still working out what to do about a 10-year-old in a courthouse and a highway shoulder when the ground under both of them changed. A long-haul truck coming up fast in the near lane, running wide on the curve. The road empty enough at that hour that its driver had stopped expecting anyone to be standing on it. Caleb had drifted half a step toward the white line without meaning to. Worn down after 2 nights without real sleep, his footing going before his mind caught up to where his feet had carried him. The horn sounded a half-second before her arm did. She hooked him back off the line hard enough to knock the sign out of his hands. And the truck went by close enough that its wind pulled at both their jackets and flattened the grass along the shoulder. And then it was gone. Tail lights shrinking down the highway. And the shoulder stood quiet again, except for the two of them getting their breath back. Caleb bent down first and picked the sign back up off the gravel, brushed it clean with the flat of his hand, and held it against his chest again. Because there was still a trial at 9, and nothing about the last 10 seconds had changed that. Her name was Ren Castillo, and she did not lecture him about the white line. And she did not ask why a 10-year-old was standing alone on a highway before sunrise. She picked up her own kickstand, told him to get on, and pulled the column of engines behind her off the shoulder in one smooth turn. 20 minutes later, he sat in a red vinyl booth at a diner off the next exit, a plate of eggs going cold in front of him because his hands would not steady enough to hold a fork properly. And a woman named Dottie kept refilling a coffee cup nobody had touched, telling him in a voice that did not require an answer that nobody left her diner hungry, court date or no court date. Behind the counter, taped to the edge of the register where she made change 100 times a day, hung a photograph gone soft at the corners. A man in a leather vest, grinning, one hand on the tank of his motorcycle. Nobody explained the photograph out loud. Nobody had to, not among the dozen riders who had rolled in behind Ren and filled the counter stools and the booths, because every one of them already knew whose face it was. A man near the door, older, gray hair cut close, a battered leather wallet in one hand instead of a phone, kept glancing at Caleb's sign where Ren had propped it against the sugar dispenser, and kept touching the breast pocket of his cut, checking without looking that something was still inside it. His name was Bishop, and what he carried folded in that pocket was a patch that had never been sewn onto anyone's vest. A wolf's head, hand-stitched, its edges gone soft after 8 months of being carried and never once worn. Not everyone in that diner was glad to see a stranded 10-year-old turn into a diner full of leather at 6 in the morning. Gunner Cole, the biggest man in the room by a clear margin, sat with his arms crossed over a faded vest and said what a few others were only thinking. A courthouse full of cameras. A kid who wasn't theirs to be tangled up in. We ride him somewhere safe and we let the system handle its own business, he said. Not unkindly, just certain, the same way he was certain about most things. Nobody argued with him yet, because nobody yet knew what Bishop was about to find out. It was Bishop who finally leaned in and read the whole sign properly, the part nobody in the rush of the highway had taken time to notice. Please. Trial at 9. Need a ride. And underneath, smaller, added almost as an afterthought in a shakier hand. I saw what happened. Won't let them say I didn't. The diner went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it realizes, all at once, that it has been looking at the wrong story. This was not a boy who had run away from somewhere. This was a witness trying to get himself to court. Bishop set the folded patch down on the counter beside the cardboard sign, gently, as if the two objects belonged next to each other. And across the room, Reaper Ray, 58, sunglasses on even indoors, a leather ledger tucked under one arm, went very still. "Bishop," he said, "whose corner did this kid see? If a story like this one is the kind that stays with you, this is the moment to hit subscribe. Because what this boy witnessed is about to turn into something none of these writers expected to be carrying by the end of the day." Bishop did not answer right away. He turned the patch over once in his fingers, and then he told them. 8 months earlier, on the shoulder of Route 70 near mile marker 112, a rider named Nathan Poole, Cinder to every man in that room, had stopped to help a stranded family change a tire in the dark, waving them clear of the lane with his own body between them and the traffic. And a car had come up fast, and the driver had not stopped. Cinder had been 6 days from finishing 20 years with the club, and had already promised his daughter he'd teach her to ride that spring. He had spent that whole last week teasing Junie about which color helmet she'd pick, and the helmet was still sitting, unbought, on a list taped inside a kitchen drawer nobody in that house had touched since. The case had gone nowhere in 8 months. No cameras on that stretch of highway, no plate anyone official could confirm, and a county sheriff's office with 100 other open files, and no particular reason to keep this one at the top of the stack. Insufficient evidence, the letter from the county had said, twice, in language so flat it could have been about a stolen bicycle instead of a man's whole life. And here, sitting in a diner booth in church clothes with eggs going cold in front of him, sat a 10-year-old boy who had watched the whole thing happen from his foster father's truck and had been carrying the exact plate number in his memory ever since. Not because anyone had told him to remember it, but because remembering things exactly was the one habit that 8 months of living with Roy Tanner had trained into him better than anything else. Ray set his coffee down without drinking it. Around the room, a dozen writers who had spent 8 months treating a stalled case like a wound that would not close went quiet in a different register now. The quiet of people recalculating everything they thought they understood about the night that had cost them a brother. "The Poole case," Ray said mostly to himself, and then louder to Bishop. "Get Renee on the phone." Even Gunner had gone quiet by then, his arms still crossed but his certainty from 20 minutes earlier plainly working its way loose. He didn't say so out loud. He just stopped saying the system could handle its own business, which for a man like Gunner amounted to the same thing. Caleb, watching all of this from the booth, did not fully understand yet what he had walked into. He understood only that a room full of men most of the county was frightened of had gone careful and quiet around him, as if he were something they had decided, without a vote, to protect. Renee Poole arrived at the diner an hour later with her daughter Junie in tow, both of them in the half-dressed rush of people who left a house without stopping to choose shoes. Renee was 41, and she had spent 8 months keeping Cinder's wedding ring on a chain at her throat and the case file for his death inside a school binder. A proper folder would have made it look like something the county had already closed, and a binder made it look, at least to her, like homework she still meant to finish. She had heard insufficient evidence often enough that the words had stopped meaning anything at all. When Bishop told her quietly by the pie case that a witness had walked in on his own 2 feet that morning, she did not cry. She set both hands flat on the counter and stood very still, the way a person tests whether the ground under them will actually hold before trusting their full weight to it. Junie was 12, with a braid coming loose and a sketchbook she carried everywhere. mostly wolves drawn in the margins of homework she had not finished either. She slid into the booth across from Caleb without asking, and without any of the careful, delicate handling most adults in that diner were using around him that morning. She told him, flatly, that her father used to bring home kids like him sometimes, kids nobody else wanted to drive anywhere, and that he would have liked Caleb fine. Then she pulled a pair of riding gloves out of her backpack, too big for either of their hands, worn soft at the palm, and set them on the table between them without a word about whose they had been. Caleb understood without being told. He put them on anyway, both of them far too big, and he did not take them off again for the rest of the morning. While Renee sat with Bishop working out what a subpoenaed witness would need before 9 o'clock, the rest of the diner kept moving in the small, practical way people move when they have decided a morning matters. Dottie called the diner 2 exits down to see if anyone there had a spare booster seat for the ride, then remembered Caleb was 10, not 4, and laughed at herself. It made him a second plate anyway, because the first one had gone cold untouched. Wren sat at the counter with a road atlas open, tracing the fastest legal route to the courthouse with one finger and calling out the turns to Ray, who wrote them into his ledger under a fresh page. A younger rider nobody had introduced, yet found a spare county courthouse parking map on somebody's phone and printed it off at the gas station next door, just so nobody would be standing around lost when the column arrived. Nobody made a speech about any of it. They simply did the small, unglamorous work of getting one frightened boy to one appointment on time, the same way they would have done it for one of their own. The diner door opened hard enough to ring the bell twice, and Roy Tanner stood in the frame in the same jacket he wore to church, scanning the room until he found Caleb boxed into a booth surrounded by leather vests. He did not raise his voice. Raising his voice was never how Roy operated, and certainly not with a room full of witnesses in it. He crossed the floor with the caseworker's smile back on, the one Priya Nair had seen 3 weeks earlier and believed, and told Caleb it was time to go home, that they would talk about the trial later, that a man was probably worried sick looking for a boy who had gone missing that morning. Every word of it would have landed easy and reasonable on anyone who did not already know him. Caleb's hand found the edge of the booth table and closed around it, and he did not stand up. Ray was on his feet before Roy finished the sentence, not fast, not aggressive, just suddenly and immovably there. Between the booth and the door, arms loose at his sides, in the same stance every rider in that room had watched him take 100 times when a thing needed holding steady. "The boy's under subpoena," Ray said. "You don't get him alone this morning. Not you, not anybody." Roy's smile thinned but held, and he started in on something about a father's rights. And that was the moment Trooper Nadia Reyes, called in by Dottie the instant the door opened, stepped forward with her notepad already out, writing down the time, the words, the plain fact of it. Roy Tanner looked at a dozen leather vests standing very still and very close together, and at a state trooper writing his name into a report, and decided the smarter move was the door. He left without Caleb, the bell over the door ringing once more behind him. Reyes logged the encounter as attempted witness contact hours before trial, and told Renee quietly that the note alone would matter in front of a judge that afternoon. Gunner watched Roy's truck pull out of the lot through the front window and said, to nobody in particular, that he'd changed his mind about the system handling its own business. Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. The rest of that morning moved faster than anything had moved in 14 months. County Prosecutor Elena Vega, 39, took a call from Reyes and rearranged her entire pre-trial schedule inside of 20 minutes. Once she understood a subpoenaed minor witness had a documented tampering attempt logged against him hours before he was due on the stand. A child advocate was pulled in to sit beside Caleb before testimony. The caseworker who should have arranged his ride in the first place got a phone call that would cost her an uncomfortable meeting later that week. None of it was dramatic. It was paperwork and phone calls and a prosecutor rearranging a Tuesday. And it was, in its plain, unglamorous shape, the first time in 14 months that every adult with real authority over Caleb's life was working toward the same thing at the same time. While the calls were still going out, Wren sat down across from Caleb in the booth and, without making a thing of it, asked him what he wanted to happen to the truck sign once this was over. Did he want to keep it, throw it out, burn it in the lot behind the diner? Nobody had asked him a single question yet that morning that wasn't about the crash or the trial or where he'd sleep that night. He thought about it a long moment, turning a coffee stirrer between two fingers, and said he wanted to keep it, because it was the only thing he'd ever made that had actually worked. Wren said that was about the best reason to keep anything she'd ever heard, and left it at that. Ray planned the rest of it slow and exact. The same care he gave everything that mattered, with an eye on every place it could still go wrong. He would not let 60 riders roll up on a courthouse looking like a threat for somebody's phone camera to misread. No revving the engines outside the doors. No crowding anybody in. Riders would park in formation on the public sidewalk, which was legal, and stand in silence, which took more discipline from 60 grown men than it sounds like it should. Gunner, of all people, was the one who worked out the parking order with Reyes ahead of time, so there'd be no question raised about a permit. Bishop kept Cinder's patch in his breast pocket the whole time he helped plan it. And once, when somebody asked whether they ought to bring it inside the courtroom itself, he said no. Some things belonged outside, he said, in the sun, where Cinder would have stood anyway. They rolled out from the diner a little after 7, close to 60 engines by the time the last chapter members peeled off the highway and fell into line. Headlights cutting long cones through a sky just beginning to pale at the edges. Caleb rode the last stretch in Wren's sidecar, Junie's father's gloves still on his hands, the cardboard sign folded flat across his knees because nobody had thought to leave it behind, and he had not wanted them to. They passed mile marker 112, holding a steady 40, and every rider in that column eased off the throttle for exactly that quarter mile without a word passed between them. An old, unspoken thing the whole chapter did every time they rode this stretch, done today with a frightened boy in the middle of the column instead of only their own grief. The courthouse sat at the far end of a wide plaza with a long run of stone steps out front. And from 2 blocks away, Caleb could already tell something was wrong with the picture. Too many parked motorcycles, row on row of them, chrome catching the early light in a shape that read less like a crowd and more like a wall. He did not understand what he was looking at until Wren cut the engine and he could hear, over the ringing settling out of his ears, that the wall stood silent. Nobody spoke. No engines idling. Just 60 riders standing shoulder to shoulder up both sides of the courthouse steps arrived hours before he had, waiting on a boy they had known for less than a day. Somewhere down the line, unmistakably the biggest man on either side of the steps. Gunner had planted himself first, before 6 that morning, before anyone else in the chapter had even arrived. Bishop met him at the bottom step and crouched down to his eye level, the folded patch still in his breast pocket. Caleb's sign held loose in one hand, where the boy had passed it over without being asked. "You don't need to carry this one up," Bishop told him. And for the first time since the trailer of this story began, Caleb walked forward with both hands empty. He climbed the courthouse steps between 2 long, silent lines of leather and chrome. 60 riders who had never met him the day before and would not let him walk in alone that morning. And at the top of the steps, Elena Vega was waiting with the child advocate. And beyond the doors, a courtroom already filling for the morning docket. The courtroom was smaller than Caleb had pictured it. Wood-paneled, fluorescent lit, a county seal behind the judge's bench. Rows of plain benches mostly empty at this hour, except for a handful of reporters and a court clerk arranging files. Roy Tanner sat at the defense table in a borrowed-looking suit, hands folded, the picture of a reasonable man wrongly accused. Beside him, Alan Prentice arranged 3 neat stacks of paper with the practiced calm of a man who had done this exact thing in this exact courtroom many times before, and expected to win it the same way he always had. Only 2 people were allowed past the gallery doors with Caleb. The child advocate, a soft-spoken woman named Priya, who had sat with him twice already that week to walk through what the room would look like, and Elena Vega, who had promised him the night before that nobody in that room would ask him a single question she had not already told him to expect. He was sworn in standing on a wooden step stool someone had found for exactly this purpose. His sneakers a full size too big for the moment. Junie's father's gloves left behind on the bench outside because a bailiff had gently explained he couldn't wear them to testify. Through the small window at the back of the courtroom, if he had turned to look, he would have seen a single strip of sky and, just past the glass, the shoulders of 2 riders posted quietly at the courthouse door. He did not turn to look. He kept his eyes on the flag behind the judge's bench instead, exactly as Vega had told him to, if he ever needed somewhere steady to look. Alan Prentice was 51 and had built a career on making inconvenient witnesses look unreliable. And he had a plan ready for a 10-year-old that had worked for him before. Rattle the timeline, question the memory, remind the courtroom with every careful word that this was, after all, only a minor. He referred to Caleb throughout as the minor, and never once by his own name, which was its own kind of tell to anyone in the room paying attention. He walked Caleb through the night of the crash 3 separate times, from 3 different angles, hunting for the one inconsistency that would let him move to strike the whole account. First the sequence of events, then the lighting and the distance. Then, more pointed, whether a boy living in the defendant's own household could really be trusted to remember any of it without being coached. He never found one. Caleb answered every question the same plain way he had rehearsed it inside his own head for 8 months. Not fast, not dramatic, exact. The mile marker, the make of the truck, the plate number worn smooth from being turned over so many times in memory. The order it all happened in, start to finish, unchanged each time he told it. He described the family stranded on the shoulder, the man in the leather vest waving them back from the lane, the sound before the swerve, the tail lights not slowing. When Prentice asked sharply how a boy could be so certain of a license plate glimpsed for 2 or 3 seconds in the dark, Caleb answered that he read plates the way other kids read cereal boxes, out of habit, because it gave him something to do with his eyes when the truck cab went quiet and he didn't want to look at whoever was driving. Prentice had no follow-up for that. He did not look at Roy Tanner once while he spoke. He looked at the prosecutor and then at the judge and answered every question in front of him exactly as he had promised himself he would, back on all those mornings spent folding and refolding a square of cardboard until his hands finally stopped shaking. Prentice moved to strike the testimony as unreliable, citing the witness's age and his residence in the defendant's own household as grounds either way it could be argued. Too young to trust, or too close to the defendant to trust, whichever served the motion better. The judge called a short recess, reviewed the transcript line by line, and denied the motion outright, ruling the minor's account both internally consistent and independently corroborated by the physical evidence already entered. The repaired damage on Roy Tanner's truck matched at last to a mile marker, a time, and a plate number a 10-year-old had never gotten wrong across 3 separate tellings. There was no shouting when the ruling came, no scene, nothing a camera would have called dramatic. The judge read the finding in the same flat procedural voice used for every other case on that morning's docket, revoked Roy Tanner's bail pending sentencing, and had him remanded on the spot. 2 bailiffs walked him out a side door. He did not look back at the boy who had put him there, It was the quietest thing in the world, a man's whole certainty that no one would believe a foster kid, undone entirely by paperwork and a docket number. And outside on the courthouse lawn, word of it reached 60 riders before Caleb ever came back through the doors. Renee Poole was waiting on the lawn with Junie's hand in hers when the doors opened and Caleb came out flanked by Vega and the child advocate, blinking against the sun after a long stretch indoors. Bishop reached into his breast pocket and drew out the patch he had carried folded for 8 months, turning it over once more before he closed the last few steps to where Renee stood. "He gave your husband his day," Bishop said, and then set the patch into Renee's open hand. The wolf's head worn soft at every edge from being carried and never sewn onto anything, because there had been no finished story to sew it onto until today. Renee closed her fingers around it and came apart all at once. 8 months of insufficient evidence and school binder patience breaking loose in a single motion. And she crossed the last stretch of lawn and pulled Caleb into her arms before he had time to brace against it. Junie reached them a half-second later, both arms wrapped around the two of them, still wearing the twin of the gloves now on Caleb's hands. Around the three of them, 60 riders went quiet in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when it has decided, without a word passed between them, to let a moment belong entirely to the people standing inside it. What happened over the weeks that followed came in the plain, unglamorous shape most real repayment takes. The county placed Caleb with a vetted foster family the club had personally vouched for to the court, 2 streets over from Miss Dottie's diner. Reyes and Vega both filed statements supporting the placement, citing the morning's tampering attempt as exactly the kind of thing a child witness should never again be left to face alone. The Iron Wolves did not disappear once the paperwork cleared. A rotating handful of them showed up at Caleb's new address every week for months afterward. Sometimes Wren, sometimes Bishop, and most weeks Gunner, the man who had argued loudest at the start against getting tangled up in some court thing, and who had planted himself on the courthouse steps before 6 that morning, ahead of every other rider in the chapter. His new foster parents, a retired schoolteacher and her husband, who ran a small engine repair shop out of their garage, learned fast not to be alarmed by the sound of motorcycles pulling up on a Sunday afternoon. By the second month, they had a standing pot of coffee ready before the engines even finished idling down. Caleb started riding along on short, careful errands in Wren's sidecar once the weather turned warm, always with a helmet buckled snug and Junie's father's gloves on his hands. And slowly the ride to school stopped being something he dreaded and became something closer to ordinary. Ray closed the ledger entry on Cinder Poole's name that same week, not by writing it off, but by opening a new page underneath it. The club voted, without much debate, to start something they called Cinder's Run, a standing arrangement so that any kid in the county ever subpoenaed as a witness, with nobody able to drive them, would have a lawful, silent escort instead, from wherever they were to wherever the law needed them to be. Wren drafted the first set of rules herself on a diner napkin before anyone had the sense to find real paper. No engines revved near a courthouse, no cameras invited, never more riders than a judge's own bailiff was comfortable seeing on the steps. Gunner, of all people, insisted on that last rule loudest of anyone, having learned exactly how a crowd that size could be misread by somebody watching from a window. Miss Dottie cleared a corner of the diner counter for the paperwork, the same corner she had cleared for 100 smaller things before. Renee Poole became the first person to volunteer to help run it, in her husband's name, in a binder that finally had somewhere good to end. Cinder's Run kept it simple on purpose. A caseworker or a court clerk left a name and a hearing time on a card at Dottie's register. No explanation required beyond that, and whichever rider was free that week picked the card up and made the call. No cameras came along for it after that first morning. Ray made that a standing rule, because the point had never been the 60 on the steps, only what the 60 on the steps had made possible. By the spring, the card box by the register had helped 4 other kids get where the law needed them on time, none of it ever making the news. All of it quietly doing exactly the job it was built for. Caleb kept the gloves. He grew into them slower than either of them had expected. His cardboard sign, the one he had lettered by garage light on the worst morning of his life, ended up framed and hung beside Dottie's register, right next to the photograph of a grinning man with one hand on his motorcycle tank. 2 objects that had each waited, in their own fashion, for the same morning to finally mean something. He still remembers plate numbers and mile markers out of old habit, the same easy recall some kids keep for baseball statistics. Though these days, there is nobody left he needs to prove anything to. So here is what we're asking. At the end of this one, if you have ever been the person who stopped when everyone else kept driving, or the one who finally got the ride nobody else would give you, tell us about it in the comments below. What time are you listening tonight, and where in the world are you listening from? We read every one of them. This is a work of fiction. The Iron Wolves are an invented club, and the people and events described here are dramatized. Any resemblance to real persons or actual cases is entirely coincidental. But the shape of the thing is true enough, because you already know it happens. A kid nobody would drive, and somebody who stopped anyway. The lights stay on, the coffee stays hot, and on Route 70, the road always stays open for family.